Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, amma ba'd. We are in topic 5. We are discussing about the distribution of income and wealth in an Islamic economic system, and we have discussed about the 3 goals of distributions as discussed by Munawar Iqbal. The following are the 3 goals. The first one is to ensure the fulfillment of basic needs to everyone in the economy. And then goal number 2 is to ensure equity. Equity is not equality. And the third goal is to reduce income gap in the economy. The strategy to understand the 3 goals here, I divide the discussion into 2 parts. The first one is to know what are the meaning of each of these goals, and then number 2 is to know how to achieve them. So our discussion before, we have discussed the meaning or the definition of basic needs. At least I have shared 4 possible ways we can define what are basic necessities. Definitely there can be more approaches to understand or to define what are basic necessities, but the following are what we have discussed earlier, and I talk about point number 3, that is how we can establish the poverty line income using some example such as the following. You identify, first you need good data set, you arrange them from the lowest to the highest, and then you identify the percentile, get the median, because from the median, half of the median basically tell us the relative poverty level, this one, and then half of the relative poverty level give us the measure of hardcore poverty or absolute poverty. Our focus in the discussion is more on material aspect of poverty. We don't mention the word eradication of poverty specifically in our 3 goals of distribution in the slide earlier. But if we manage to achieve goal number 1, basically that would also automatically addresses the problem of poverty, especially the problem of hardcore poverty. This is the another sample based on the common reports made by many agencies in Malaysia, where the government usually categorizes households into the B40 category, M40 category, and T20 category. Using the percentile approach, basically that's the basic way how they establish this type of categorizations. We talk about inequality, how to reduce the problem of income inequality. The third goal is about reducing the income gap, income inequality. I presented to you the Lorenz curve. This is the Lorenz curve, and down here is the measure of Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is derived from the above diagram. What is important for you to know for this course is to be able to read reports related to Gini coefficients. The Gini coefficient ranges from 0 to 1. 0 means perfect equality and 1 means perfect inequality. And I presented here the reports based on Gini coefficient based on Malaysia. The top one, that's for Malaysia, and the reports below, the Gini coefficients for urban and also ethnicity. This is an example. What we have here is the idea of distribution. If you can recall, the third goal of distribution is to reduce income gap in the economy. And in an economy with huge income gap is given by distribution B. This one, distribution B, this is where you have wider gap of income. For example, you can see This is the top income level, and then you have the median or the average income in the middle here, and this is the bottom income level. So you can see the gap for distribution B, the gap between the bottom, let's say 10% versus the middle income is very wide, and also the same in the case of those at the top level of income. On the other hand, distribution A represents a case of narrow income gap. So this is to give us the context. When we say one of the goal of distribution in the Islamic economic system is to reduce income gap, you can imagine something like distribution A. These are some other reports that I can just to show, but I will not discuss this. These reports are about Gini coefficients. Gini coefficients, you can present the Gini based on education level, urban rural category, ethnicity. Those are the common ways how people or statisticians will report Gini coefficient. Even you can report Gini based on gender if you like. Depends on how comprehensive is the data set for you to manipulate the presentation of the Gini. Once we know the three goals of distributions, the next thing is for us to discuss about how to achieve the goals. Remember that each of the goal, three of them, they are interrelated. Therefore, if we say here, I will present about some strategies that we can employ to address the problem of basic needs fulfillment. This is not just for addressing basic need fulfillment. The strategies outlined here also are crucial to achieve the other two goals of distribution. So then, when we talk about basic needs fulfillment, we should start to address the problem of basic needs at the individual level. We need to address the problem of basic needs at the individual level first. Often, many people in the economy would say poverty issue should be handled by the government. Yes, that's the natural behavior or attitude of voters. We would choose the government that are concerned about our welfare. That's true. However, we can at the other level, at the individual level, people need to work and address their own problem first before they can rely on others. And that's also the Islamic approach to address the issue of basic needs. For example, if you look at how our religion teaches us to address the issue of basic needs fulfillment, there is a level that we can say it's become wajib, it's become compulsory for each individual to find something like work, to work in order to earn something for himself and his family. It's become wajib for a father to provide for his family, to provide nafkah to the family. That's wajib. It's a requirement. So that's one rulings that we get from the teaching of our own religion, Islam. Another example, so when I highlight the word compulsory here, at the individual level, you can think about the requirement to provide nafkah to the family. That's number one. And if you can remember, there is also the requirement, obligation for us Muslim to pay zakat. And I'm referring to zakatul mal. Every Muslim should have the attitude that he or she doesn't want to be a zakat recipient. We want to be a zakat payer. And to be a zakat payer, that requires certain good level of income. If you can still remember, just in my past example, I give you the case of zakat on livestock. The minimum amount of cows or buffaloes for a person to pay zakat on the livestock is 30 cows or 30 buffaloes. And that means the person is out of poverty. In fact, he can help others. For the person that can fulfill the obligation on zakatul mal, basically the person has no basic needs issue. He's out of poverty. He is in fact at the level of able to help other people. So that's number two, related to compulsory level at the individual level. So this is, I hope it is clear now. Just to add something, but this is compulsory at the other angle, not directly involving basic needs. For example, the compulsory or the obligation for us Muslim to perform Hajj. The requirement to perform Hajj is to be able to travel and also ability to finance the traveling of oneself to perform Hajj and also to leave some nafkah to those family members at home. Those who can fulfill the obligation of Hajj, basically, in general, majority of them have settled the issue of basic needs. So these are the within systemic teaching of Islam that would become motivations for Muslims to work hard to achieve something in life, and definitely basic needs issues would be settled at that level. I hope that's clear. And then if we move further apart from compulsory, there is also the level of fardu kifayah in our religion that necessitates our sensitivity as an individuals, as neighbors, as members of the society to look around and to be sensitive on the plight of other people. Example like we need to be aware of our neighbors' condition, if they live in hardship, whether they have food to eat, whether they are sick, and that's involve societal level engagement. That's fardu kifayah. For example, in our classroom, if you come to know that there is one student who is really in the category of fakir, the situation where he or she cannot even afford to eat proper meal for the day or for the month, you should do something in order to help the person. If you cannot help financially, you can bring the issue to the right authority so that something can be done to address the problem. That's fardu kifayah. So that's another context of basic needs fulfillment, how we can address that. And then basic need fulfillment also can be addressed through the voluntary acts. This is very wide in Islam. For example, voluntary in terms of sadaqah, the establishment of foundations of waqaf, that's also voluntary. And from these voluntary works, most of the target is to address the issue of poverty and welfare. Basically, that's how we can connect to these three concepts, fardu kifayah, voluntary and compulsory. Maybe the arrangement is a bit weird, but I started with compulsory, then we can go to fardu kifayah, and then voluntary. Voluntary is recommended, and that's the engagement at the individual level. Definitely we can extend that before we talk about where is the government to address the issue of basic needs. We can extend that to the participations of other entities such as firms and also the NGOs, the voluntary sectors. Firms, usually we talk about corporate social responsibilities, and that's also become another mechanism how basic needs can be fulfilled. Maybe some of you get scholarship for your education. Education is basic needs. And firms that provide the scholarship, they give you in the form of private transfer payment. That scholarship is a private transfer payment. So that's one example. Firms also may be active to provide certain types of facilities, like some hotels would donate some food to the homeless, and this type of corporate social responsibilities are common. done by many companies. And definitely we can also talk about the non-profit organization, the NGOs. And there are many forms of organizations that are very active in addressing welfare issues, poverty, homelessness, and many other related concerns requiring assistance, especially in fulfilling basic needs. Okay? So these are other types of engagement we can relate to this, how to achieve this goal of distribution. Once we talk about all those entities, then we can expect something coming from the government, the responsibility of the state, what the government can do. I don't start with the government first, because often we think like that, at least in the context of Malaysia, we always ask what the government does for me. So here, these are some examples that the government can provide in order to achieve basic needs fulfillment. To provide public goods related to basic needs, education. Therefore, we have public schools, public universities, slightly cheaper and have a lot of subsidies provided. You want to get textbook, tuition fees, very much subsidized in public universities. And primary and secondary schools in Malaysia are almost free basically. So that's public goods. Other example of public goods such as public hospital, where citizens can get their healthcare need provided at a cheaper price or free by the government. So this is what we can see as a way to address the issue of basic needs. Another example is where the government can provide price control on certain essential goods and services. This is also very common, especially in Malaysia. Basic necessities, items such as rice, cooking oil, sugar, even chicken, especially near the festive season, the government would step in and then provide the price control on these essential items. Therefore, the low-income groups in particular, they would find these basic items are more affordable to them. So this is number two. Another way how the government can address the issue of basic needs is to provide subsidies. Subsidies such as education subsidies. We have a lot of subsidies for our energy consumption. In Malaysia, your petrol, and then our electricity, our water bills. These are heavily subsidized by the government, to the point that the sustainability for the government to keep providing the subsidies is questionable. Therefore, you can see the recent movement, you can see the recent move or approach taken by the current administration. They just launched PADU, pengkalan data bersepadu, so that they have enough information about household in Malaysia, and then they want to give a more targeted subsidies. Petrol subsidies, for example, according to the government, majority of the beneficiaries from petrol subsidies are the rich people, because the rich people, they travel a lot using their cars, they have a lot of cars, and therefore they are the main beneficiaries from petrol subsidies. It doesn't get to the right targets. Therefore, that's what we term as subsidy rationalization. The same for electricity bill and so on. So that's just to show how the government can take the approach of providing subsidies as a mechanism to ensure basic needs fulfillment. Even for food, the government would subsidize a lot of food items to ensure affordability, especially when the food are imported from overseas. So that's another information for us to realize. This is not just done by this country, the Malaysian government, but any government that are sensitive to the issue of basic needs would take all these approaches to ensure basic needs fulfillment. Transfer payment at the government level, when we say transfer payment here, we are talking about public transfer payment. Example of the examples of public transfer payment are like Bantuan Rakyat Satu Malaysia. That's from the previous administration. Easy to remember that. That's why I like to give that example. That's a form of welfare payments. It's a direct cash transfer. And quite recently, Malaysian government seems to be keener to provide cash transfer to the citizens. One of the motivation is to promote the usage of e-wallets. That's why the government would announce, the government would like to transfer certain amount of money to, let's say, people with certain level of income. Recently, there's a Madani 100 ringgit e-wallet transferred to those earning less than 100,000 ringgit per year. So everybody want that 100 ringgit. They register with the system and then they get 100 ringgit transferred to them. Just for your information, 100 ringgit may not be much to some people, but that can be so meaningful to other group of people. But when the government give this 100 ringgit for in this example, the Madani example, among other reason why they gave it is, number one, to give some money. Yes, that's the direct intention maybe. That's the direct that's the direct impact we can see. Number two is the government actually want to have citizens to update their information on the system rather than hiring consultant to do survey to collect the data. The best way to achieve this is provide a platform, let citizens themselves register, and to incentivize them, give them 100 ringgit. So that's a win-win strategy employed by the government in this example. So that's just for your information on that money transfer. I think last year in the budget also, students get, I think 200 ringgit something. And so that to encourage the use of e-wallets, and then you also will register to the platform and the government can then have data about their citizens. Data now is very important so that the government can manage welfare, subsidies, transfer payment and so on. So that's on transfer payment. Direct transfer payment, that's one. If you read many articles, economists also would describe this direct cash transfer as a helicopter money. Helicopter money. Helicopter money is more famous in a more corrupt system, especially near the election. The term helicopter money is because in certain countries, the authority would just drop money from the helicopter, especially for election or whatever. But that's the extreme description about helicopter money. Another less extreme understanding is helicopter money is a form of cash, direct cash given by the government. Sometimes the intention is good, not to buy votes, but really to help. There are a lot of arguments about whether it is good to give cash and you know when for welfare and whatnot, whether that is a good approach or not is is a debatable issue in economics. So that's transfer payment. And another approach that the government can take is to introduce the minimum wage policy as a mechanism to address the issue of basic needs fulfillment. What is the minimum wage policy? So this is an example of the minimum wage analysis. Just for you to understand this policy, Malaysia has introduced minimum wage policy, and recently the government has increased the rate to 1,500 ringgit per month. Many students have a misconception about the minimum wage policy, thinking that everybody will get this minimum wage. No, minimum wage is for the low skill workers. When you graduate, you will not get minimum wage because most likely you will earn graduate salary unless the employer take advantage of your graduate qualification and just pay you the minimum wage. Then the employer is exploiting your knowledge, your skills, your human capital. Usually those who earn, usually those the low skill workers, they are entitled for the minimum wage policy. Let's see this example. This is the market for labor, where we are describing the labor market equilibrium. This upward sloping curve as this is the supply of labor, and the downward sloping curve here is the demand for labor by firms. The horizontal line measures the employment level, and the vertical line measures the wage rates. Let's say before the minimum wage policy, the labor market relies on demand and supply interactions. So the demand and supply would take place, and we have the equilibrium level here. W star is the equilibrium wage rate, and L star is the equilibrium level of employment in the economy. Imagine now, if we let the market to decide the wage rate can be, let's say, slightly lower than enabling the worker to afford some level of basic needs. Imagine, for example, letting market to decide on the wage rates, W star is equal to 700 ringgit. Just as an example, 700 ringgit per month. That's low in the current context to afford a lot of basic needs. You cannot have much basic needs with 700 ringgit. Just to pay for house rent in Kuala Lumpur, in general, depends on the location. Most of the areas we can say minimum is around 1,000 ringgit per month. 700 ringgit. If you can get rental around 500, you are very lucky. That's not to take into account the electricity bills and other things you need. That's not enough, basically. Therefore, then the government steps in and introduces the minimum wage. Let's denote W min as the minimum wage. You can imagine W min here is equal to 1,500, referring to the current rate set by Malaysian government. So we write here 1,500. What's the implication of the minimum wage? The first thing is those workers who get this minimum wage, they are the low skill workers. Now their welfare are well taken care, because the worker now earn 1,500 per month. The issue with the minimum wage is it is a double-edged sword policy, because notice that once the government introduces the minimum wage, firms would find the rate is too high for them, and therefore demand for workers by firm would drop to L1. Before the minimum wage, demand for workers by firms are given by L star. Now it drops to L1. Therefore, only those lucky workers, those skilled workers, who are still employed, who are employed and get this minimum wage, they benefit from the policy. Those workers who were laid off by firms because of the introduction of the minimum wage, notice that when wage goes up due to the minimum wage, some firms lay off their workers, and because of that, some workers are now unemployed. And who will take care of this unemployed? That's the question. Their welfare now are They can't even afford, these unemployed workers can't even afford basic needs now because they have no income due to being laid off by the firms. So that's another issue. Another issue with minimum wage policy is this. The higher minimum wage would also attract more workers to get into the job markets. And if you consider the distance here, this is a case where there's a surplus of workers in the economy. And since the market is no longer flexible because the market cannot adjust downward on the wage rate, the market cannot adjust the wage rate downward because the government already locked the wage at 1,500 here. So this surplus is something that is not addressed by the market itself. The market cannot address this issue by itself due to the minimum wage. So this is some considerations in the context of minimum wage. Policymakers need to look at the pros and cons on the introduction of the minimum wage. Going back to this slide, to recap, if you look at the strategies to fulfill basic needs fulfillment, I started by emphasizing on the participation by the private sectors. We started by the roles individual can play to address his or her own basic needs, and then society, at the societal level, societal engagement in the teaching of Islam, we have fardu kifayah, and then firms can also play their roles as well as the NGOs. And then the following are some of the examples that the government can do to ensure the fulfillment of basic needs. Definitely the government can come up with other creative solutions to address basic needs. Just an example, when the government promoted the idea of menu rahmah, for example, the government actually is encouraging private sectors, companies, restaurants to provide affordable meal. So the government does not really give money to the companies directly so that they can provide menu rahmah, but just as an encouragement. It's a voluntary basis. That's an initiative from the government where there is a collaboration between government and the private sector together to address the issue of basic needs. So there can be many other creative solutions to addressing the issue of basic needs. So that's on this point, the first goal. If you have question, you can ask me. Another approach to address the issue of, all right, here, what I want to address, referring back to the three goals of distribution, now let's consider a more holistic approach that the Islamic economic system, now let's consider a more holistic approach available in the Islamic economic system to capture this holistic approach in the Islamic economic system. You can refer to this diagram. This diagram will provide at least the approaches available under the Islamic economic system. I divide this diagram into two parts, the upper part and the lower part. Let's focus on the upper part first. The upper part basically are focusing on exchanges. Remember, Anas Zarqa, he talks about 4 criteria of distribution, and the first one is exchange. Exchange involves market participation, and the upper part of this diagram basically reflects exchange mechanism, and we can also relate that to the idea of functional distribution. In order to address or in order to achieve the goals of distribution, all the three goals, we want every members in the society to be productive. Therefore, if you look at the first box here, the pre-production stage, we discussed about pre-production in chapter 4, allocation of resources. Pre-production require fair access to opportunity. Let people get access to the opportunity. Some economists would say at the pre-production stage, the policy is about equal access to opportunity. Not equal distribution, but equal access to opportunity. Why? Because once people are given the opportunity, then they can explore their talents and then they can express that talents into something productive. And that is where we talk about during production stage. During production stage is the place where people are producing goods and services from the resources that they get in the pre-production stage, from the opportunity that they get in the pre-production stage. So the outputs from during production is usually goods and services. You can think like GDP, gross domestic product. People create wealth. Those who work hard, they can earn more. And that's what we want people to do so that we can achieve all the goals of distribution. Individuals work hard, address your own problems, fulfill your own basic needs. So these are the encouragement in the exchange process. From the activity, from the productive activities, then we can move to the third stage, the post-production. Once wealth have been generated, then the next question is how the wealth are shared in the economy. For sure, those who work hard, they should enjoy more of their hard-earned labor. They should enjoy more of that because they work hard for that. Definitely, they also, or the system should have some form of incentive to encourage sharing. That should come at the post-production stage. The government would introduce tax, for example, usually at the post-production stage. For example, personal income tax. After you work, you get your salary, then you need to pay your income tax. Another example like corporate tax. Corporations, they first utilize the resources and then they create value from the resources. They sell the products and services. They make revenue and profits. Then they have to pay tax. And that's happened at the post-production stage. The government then would rechannel the tax revenue for the other purposes in the economy, such as what we have discussed earlier, subsidies, to provide public goods, to provide transfer payment, and many others. So that's at the first stage, the upper part of this diagram, and that should be the main ways how people or how the system would address the issue of, the upper side here, let me rephrase, the upper side, the upper part of this diagram is the main way how the system can achieve the goal of distribution. And then under the Islamic economic system, there are also other measures that is built in through the teaching of Islam. And I divide this into two major components. First, we can look at the positive incentives, positive measures, and then the second one is preventive measures. Positive measures versus preventive measures. For each of these two, for each of them, we can divide into two more. Positive measures, we can divide into policy tools and also positive values. Positive tools, under positive measures, the policy tools that the government can have to achieve the goals of distributions are shown here. For example, the government can introduce and improve the zakat system. Zakat is under the management of the government, the states, because the state would appoint the amil. So that's zakat. And then other distributive schemes in Islam such as faraid or inheritance, waqaf, manihah. These are some other positive measures that the government can encourage or introduce or manage so that the Islamic distributive schemes are well managed and they are efficient. So if you look at all this, zakat definitely require a proper system because zakat is wajib. Faraid, inheritance also require a more comprehensive and efficient system because when someone passed away, we don't want the wealth of this deceased just to hang around without clarity who should or who without clarity who are the next beneficiaries. In Islam, the faraid rulings enable the process of intergenerational wealth transfer after one person has passed away. So that's faraid, and that's definitely require a good system, especially in the management of land. Faraid on land. Faraid on cash usually is much easier because cash is much liquid. Land, properties, that's require a better system. Otherwise, some wealth would be stuck at certain level without being utilized, become idle due to inefficiency in the management of the wealth. Wakaf also require a proper management. Today, people start to give more focus on wakaf, realizing the potential of wakaf. If you look around, some Muslims, they like to get the reward from Allah Ta'ala, and one best way to ensure continuous reward is to give wakaf. There are many studies found that many Muslims are giving their wealth, their land for wakaf to build mosques and also for graveyards. Muslim economists would rather say, before you decide on the purpose of your property, consult first with the rightful authority, let's say the Majlis Agama Islam, what actually they really need at that time. Rather than you jump and say, my land here is for this purpose. Because sometimes there can be too many mosques already in the surrounding area. Maybe we can have a land, waqaf land, for commercial buildings. And from these commercial buildings, all rents coming from that, from the shop outlets, can be channeled for education, for research, for scholarship, for welfare, and many other purposes. That can be more fruitful. That's therefore require a proper management. Manihah is a form of quote-unquote temporary wakaf. For example, this is the classic example when someone allow his friends or his neighbor to milk the cow. He owns the cow. He said to the neighbor, you can milk my cow here for 1 month. You can benefit from the cow. That's an example. That's an example of manihah. My example is if you have a lot of extra handphones, smartphones, you have the latest one, the old one you just keep idle in your drawer. Why not? If you find your friends need smartphones, you can lend it in the form of manihah. Let the person benefits. Let's say for 1 semester. After the end of the semester, return it back to you. That's give you the rewards from Allah Ta'ala. And then the property also is not just lying idle. We can also talk about hadiah, gift. This is also a form of transfer. The difference between hadiah and sadaqah is that in sadaqah, usually we give sadaqah to somebody who needs help or assistance. We give hadiah as a form of appreciation or honor. You don't give sadaqah to the Prime Minister, for example. Doesn't befitting. Nabi SAW, it is prohibited for Nabi SAW to receive sadaqah. But Nabi SAW, he would accept hadiah, gift. That's the special hukum for Prophet SAW, specific rulings. But if you think carefully why the ruling is imposed on him, among other reasons, one of it is that it's not befitting for a prophet, given his level, to get sadaqah. That's, sadaqah is for assistance. When we are sympathy to other people, we give sadaqah. Qardul Hassan, this is beautiful loan, good loan. Qard is loan, Hassan is beautiful. This is also a form of assistance that can be designed to help other people. Loan without interest, basically. Loan without interest is qard. Qardul Hassan is special. Qardul Hassan is when there are Qardul Hassan can happen in two possible. Qardul Hassan can happen in two contexts. The first one, Qardul Hassan from the side of the borrower. Let's say you borrow money from someone, 100 ringgit. As a borrower, when the time is due, you pay back to the lender, creditor, that 100 ringgit plus some more extra. In the first place, the lender does not impose any conditions. The borrower pays extra out of his own appreciation for the good action of the lender in the first place. And that's encouraged in our religion. And that is an example of Qardul Hassan coming from the borrower or debtor. The second case is Qardul Hassan coming from the creditor, the lender. Example, when the borrower wants to pay back the loan, 100 ringgit just now, then the creditor tell the borrower, you don't have to pay 100 ringgit, you can just pay 90 ringgit or 80 ringgit, or maybe the creditor just say, you don't have to pay at all. That's also an example of Qardul Hassan coming from the creditor. All these examples to show that in the teaching of Islam, under the Islamic economic system, the process to share wealth can come in many types of distributive schemes. You can consider this as the distributive schemes. These are just some of them, so that you can see various possibilities. Over here, if you can remember, when I talk about basic needs fulfillment coming from the government, most of these points are already discussed. And these are positive measures that can come from the government as the policy tools to address basic needs or to address any welfare concern in the economy. For example, the government can impose taxes, and from tax revenue, the government can then utilize that to provide many other programs, welfare programs to the citizens, to support subsidies, to provide public goods. Those are some of them, or even to provide public transfer payment. The government can introduce that, and that's definitely require deep revenue. The government needs deep pockets to sponsor or to provide all these subsidies, transfer payment, and also public goods. And also, the government can introduce the minimum wage policy, as I have discussed earlier. Definitely, there can be more other possible approaches or measures that the government can think of, depending on the needs or maslahah of the people. And these are just some examples. At the same time, under the positive measures in the teaching of Islam, there are a lot of positive values that we are encouraged to practice. We can talk about moral ethics or akhlaq. And don't forget the assumption about the Islamic man. Islamic man is a person with high values, positive values. And if you look at all the examples of values I put here, these values are very important to achieve the goals of distributions. Brotherhood, sympathy, empathy, generosity, honesty, and all this would encourage sharing. In Al-Quran, Allah talks about riba and sadaqah. When Allah talks about riba in Al-Quran, there are two main comparisons made. First, there is ayat in Al-Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah where Allah talks about riba and trade, riba and business. We will discuss this in chapter 6. There is also another ayat in Al-Quran where Allah compares riba and sadaqah. When Allah compares riba and sadaqah, you can look at the economic effect of riba and the economic effect of sadaqah. That's one way. Another way to think about it is the hearts of people who give sadaqah versus the hearts of people who take riba or who charge riba are two different hearts. I give sadaqah because I have all these positive values, strong values in my heart. My heart is full of positive values. So sadaqah is easy for me. Waqaf is easy for me. In contrast, if you look at these preventive measures, focus first on the negative values, all these negative values. These negative values, greediness, enviness, stinginess, excessiveness, selfishness, these are the heart of evil individual, the heart of lender that charges interest. Because loan shark, for example, they have very dark heart. They would do anything to pressure the borrower to repay the loan plus the excessive rate that they charge. And that's only can come from different kind of hearts, negative hearts, with all of these negative values. Very different. Two different individuals. At the same time, in the teaching of Islam, there are also the following preventive activities or preventive activities that are considered as haram. For example, riba is haram, gharar is haram, gambling is haram, hoarding is haram. All these activities that can create wider income gap in the economy. The problem will be widened, will be more serious once we allow for these activities to be practiced freely. If you can remember, when I show you the effect of riba, in model number 1, riba can create one-way direction of wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. The rich are getting richer because of riba. And basically, not just riba, all the following, gharar, speculation, hoarding, these are also have similar effects. Over here, this one, these are some of the penalties that are available in the teaching of Islam in order to stop people from certain types of negative activities or negative behavior, kafarah, penalties, or fines. And if you notice, let's wait a minute. This one. Kafarah. Kafarah is a form of penalties that is imposed on certain behavior that go against certain hukum in Islam. And in this example, what I want to highlight is the kafarah that we get from a hadith when someone during Ramadan, the husband get together with the wife, and the following hadith therefore describes the kafarah on that situation. Okay? So now look at what are the options in this kafarah, and then we will relate to the context of addressing or achieving the goals of distribution. There are 3 options given. The first one, Nabi SAW asked the person, can you afford to free a slave? This is number 1. The first option basically is already about addressing the issue of income gap, because in the early time of Islam, slavery was a problem. And when Islam came, among other encouragement, voluntarily, and this is recommended, where many companions like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq would buy slaves and free them. And the famous one is Bilal bin Rabah. Once slaves are freed, they are out of that shackle of being exploited, because slaves they are the lowest in the structure of a society. That's one issue. So Islam basically addresses that slavery issue very effectively without creating problems to the economy. Because in the United States, when Abraham Lincoln declared the freedom of slaves, overnight, all slaves ran away from their masters, ran away from their plantation estates, factories, and whatnot. So then, the economy collapsed because there were no workers to work in the plantations, in the factories, and so on. And then these slaves who ran out, they only enjoyed it for 1 day, 2 days, or maybe 1 week. Later they found they were unemployed. So then they returned to the previous master, but now they become forced workers. More or less, the situation is like slave also. So this is the first option. And then the second option, can you fast for 2 consecutive months? This is tough kafarah. And this person said no. And then look at the third option. And usually, many kafarah in Islam revolve around the third possibilities, the first and the third. Can you afford, the third one is to feed poor people. So, feeding poor, to provide food for the poor, 60 poor in this case, is also a solution in addressing the feeding the poor is also a solution to achieve the goals of distribution. At least we can talk about to fulfill basic needs. And if you look at kafarah in the teaching of Islam, is revolve around freeing slave and feeding the poor, helping the poor. And that's another way how the teaching of Islam, the Islamic economic system, addresses the issue of or achieving the goals of distribution. In particular, fulfillment of basic needs, reducing income inequality, therefore achieving equity in the economy. Going back to this diagram, the remaining slides basically talk about the implications of these negative practices such as riba. I will explain about riba in chapter 6, but one of the consequences of riba is the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And you can recall the diagram that I have shown to you before. Another negative practices that is prohibited is this activity to practice gharar, to create uncertainty in transactions. Gharar can be major gharar and minor gharar. Major one is prohibited when transactions have a lot of uncertainty. In economics, usually the element of gharar is present in the context of asymmetric information. Example like the second-hand car seller. The seller of a second-hand car, he has more knowledge, more information about the conditions of the car compared to the buyer. He may not disclose everything to the buyer. And the buyer may buy something that is not really that he would purchase if he get that hidden information that the seller doesn't disclose. Our fixed scholars would say the buyer, therefore, in order to avoid this situation, the buyer needs to ask the right questions. Don't just keep silent. If you are not sure, if you feel something need to be clarified, ask questions. If you just keep quiet, just rely on whatever information provided by the seller, then you commit to the transaction, then only you realize it's not as what you expect, then it's the buyer's own mistake. Scholars also warn about that. Another example is the problem of insurance. Usually in the context of insurance, life insurance, the buyer has more information about himself. So the insurance company want to know more about the buyer of the insurance, but the buyer would not disclose all the high risk about himself, like Maybe he is a smoker, he said he's not a smoker. Maybe his job is a high risk job, but he said it's not a high risk, so that when he want to buy that insurance, the premium is cheaper for the buyer. So that's also a problem of asymmetric information, and we can relate to gharar. Gharar also appears a lot in online transactions today. There are many examples, you can check on that. Minor gharar is, we can overlook minor gharar in many cases. Otherwise, there will be no transaction if everything you want to know. Iktinas is about hoarding. For iktinas, usually people would hide gold and silver so that they don't pay zakat. In order to skip paying zakat or to avoid paying zakat, some people would hide the gold and silver, or to transfer the ownership of the gold and silver, for example, to the other family members. So that can be one example of iktinas. Sometimes hoarding also is related to iktinas activity, especially hoarding gold and silver. Ihtikar is a form of monopoly, but abuse of monopoly power. I would say ihtikar is more about abusing the monopoly power. So that's the issue usually you can find in the discussion of why some scholars are not keen on having a monopoly, because monopoly prone to abuse the position, and therefore monopoly need to be regulated. And these are some of the price regulations that the government can have over the monopoly. You can read this later. Other ways to achieve the goals of distribution, as I will show you in the diagram, we need to encourage the positive practices, caring, compassionate, sympathy, and to give sadaqah. And then there is also should be a continuous efforts to condemn exploitative practices, to stop these practices also, fighting corruptions, fighting hoarding activities, riba, and so on. By the way, if you notice social media about this boycott issue of certain product by Israel, that's good. But I think the same campaign also should be done to those who involved in riba. But boycott also riba bank. In general, what we have discussed so far are the approaches to achieve the goals of distribution in the Islamic economic system. Basically, I have done the discussion for this chapter.
Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and share with others. Thank you.